Greetings and Maranatha. Let's jump into it. Our next two sessions are going to be chocked full, and we're going to cram a lot into this 45 minutes to an hour. So we're just going to skip preliminaries and just jump right into it. Again, recapping, we're looking at Matthew 24 and 25, which is one sermon that comes on the heels of a question in Matthew 24, verse 3, about when these things will happen, what will be the signs of the end of the age, and what will be the signs of Jesus's return. Now, that question was posed in response to a prophetic statement that Jesus made in Matthew 23 concerning the desolation of the house in Jerusalem, the violation of the city of Jerusalem, this declaration that he's going away, they won't see him again until they say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So those statements constitute these things. Now that's going to be, we've emphasized that over the last few days, but it's going to become even more important today as we begin to move through the parables that follow on the heels of Jesus's prophetic explanation. Now, the difference between what we're looking at today and what we looked at yesterday is the issue of what's called hermeneutics, meaning hermeneutics is a way to measure. It's a way to interpret Scripture. Now, up to this point, everything that we've read is just stark, hard, cold, real. There's no metaphor in it. There's no interpretation needed, meaning the word for earthquake means earthquake. The word for famine means famine. Desolation means desolation. Abomination means abomination. There's nothing that you wonder, well, I wonder if this is a symbol or a metaphor or an allegory for this. It's not. When it says Jesus is going to come on the clouds, he's going to come on the clouds. When it says that it happens after the tribulation of those days set in motion by the abomination of desolation, it simply means there's going to be an abominable act that sets in motion a time of tribulation such as never was, that's going to impact Judea primarily and then spread out from there. And then from there, the culmination of this prophetic storyline is that everything's going to go dark. The sky's going to light up with flaming fire. Jesus is going to appear and return and gather his people to himself. Now, he pushes pause in verse 31 on this straight prophecy, and he picks it up again at the end of chapter 25, and we're going to look at it when we get there. For many years when I was teaching this, I would say that the first part of the Olivet Discourse is Jesus teaching prophecy, and then the second half is a series of 7 parables. Now, while I think there's some that's helpful to outline it and simplify, I don't think it's actually true. And even on the notes that you have on the app, you can click on the notes of these sessions and you'll see the outline. And that's even how I outlined it on there. But while I think it's helpful to outline it that way to understand what it's getting at, I think it's also important to emphasize the fact that after verse 31, which is verses 4 to 31, is just stark, cold prophecy. There's nothing metaphorical. From verse 32 to the end, there is now the introduction into it, the layering in of metaphor, allegory, prophecy, parabolic language. What I want to emphasize before we move through this is that the final parable is not actually a parable. It's more like, I think it's more accurate now. Over the years, I've come to see that I think it's more accurate to say that he's actually sandwiching prophecy in the first part of the message and prophecy at the very end, and he's sandwiching it with 6 parables. But we'll get to that later. We're just going to jump right into verse 32. Now, you can outline this however you want. You can define these parables however you want. I called these battles. And you can see it on the notes, different battles, because I believe these 7 parables Jesus is giving in context to the prophecy of the end of the age. He's giving it to lay out and to describe the primary battlegrounds of the human heart in the days when these events go down. So in a way, he could have just said, "Amen. Hey boys, let's move to another spot," after verse 31, because he said all he needed to say concerning the events themselves. There's nothing left to say prophetically. And he pointed us back to Daniel. And really, in many ways, he's saying, guys, if you actually want to understand, if you're serious about that question, go study Daniel, which in our next session tomorrow, we're going to jump into Daniel. And we're going to look at the passages that Jesus is actually referring us back to in order to understand these events. Now, at this point, lots of questions come up. And this scenario, I believe, is going to present an incredible leadership and pastoral crisis in the earth. I believe that what Jesus is doing, starting in verse 32, working his way through the parables, is he's actually giving input from a pastoral level, from a shepherding level, prophetically, to explain how to navigate, to carry your heart, how to stay steady in the days when these events are beginning to go down. And that's an important point, because what often happens with the way that these 7 or 6, let's call them 7 for clarity's, just for simplicity's sake. We'll call it 6 for clarity's sake, call it 7 for simplicity's sake. These 7 parables, what often happens is preachers typically take these parables and they share them in isolation out of the context of the whole of the message. And the reality is you just simply can't do that. For example, the parable of the talents. The parable of the talents often gets pulled out, or the parable of the sheep and the goats, which again, I don't believe is a parable. I think it's a prophecy. It's an actual prophecy of what Jesus will actually do when he comes to sit on his actual throne, actually in Jerusalem. There's nothing parabolic about that. But what happens is people pull these parables and then share them out of context to make their point. You know, Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats is used to, encourage social justice endeavors. You know, the parable of the talents in 25 verse 14 is used to encourage stewardship of what God's given you. Reality is, guys, these parables don't make sense outside of their original context in the way that Jesus wanted them to be understood. Now, yes, it does encourage stewardship. The message of the sheep and the goats, it does encourage social engagement with the poor, but that is just not the context of these messages. And when we separate them from the whole, we do weird things with the passage, and then we end up avoiding the actual message itself, which is the prophetic part that we've gone through over the last few days. So now what he's going to do in verse 32 is begin to drive home the message of what he just laid out in verses 4 through 31, but he's not just driving it home to clarify the events. And this is important. Understanding end time events is not the main battleground. Understanding the events is so that we can be clear-eyed about what's coming, so that we can see the lay of the land clearly concerning the main battlegrounds of the heart. Because what the main pressure of this thing is not, these things are not going to go down. We're going to go, oh no, my end times understanding theology was wrong. No, you're going to say, oh no, I didn't prepare my heart, my mind, my family, my community for these events. So the main question then becomes, how do I prepare for these things? Should I prepare for these things? Because if the whole thing revolves around an event in Jerusalem, okay, well, I'm not seeing that event. What about people in, the 1600s, the 1300s, 700? They have access to this message, but they're going to ask the questions, how do we prepare for this? How should we anticipate your coming? How do we understand the signs of the times throughout human history so that we're clear-eyed, clear-headed, and we're engaged in what the Lord has called us to in the nations, whatever generation that we're living in? And Jesus, these 7 battlegrounds, I believe, are key battlegrounds that you and I are going to have to wage war on in order to be faithful and not to be found wanting in the days when these events begin to befall us. So with that, let's just jump in. Verse 32. Now, bear in mind, he's just transitioning from verse 31 to 32. So it's a seamless transition. There's no verse. He's sitting on the log under an olive tree in the Mount of Olives, and he's saying these things, and it's just unbroken. He goes from, and then you'll see the sign of the coming of the Son of Man, then he'll gather his elect. Then he says, now learn this lesson, verse 32. From the fig tree, learn this lesson, okay? Now, there's only 2 times in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that Jesus says, learn this lesson. One of them is in Matthew 9 about learning mercy. The other one is here. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. So in other words, here's a parable. Here's an analogy. Here's a metaphor, okay? Meaning what I'm about to say is going to help you understand the signs, the message related to the signs of the times. He says this, as soon as the fig tree as soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. Okay, so fig tree, branch putting out shoots that's going to put out leaves. He says, when you see that, you Jewish boys who understand seasons and understanding agriculture, what does that tell you about the hour in which you're living? And the boys would say, well, it means that summer's almost here. Every year we've lived it. We've seen it over and over again. The fig tree begins to blossom, and we know that summer's coming. It's the end of spring. Summer's on its way. That's obvious. And the Lord is saying this, okay, so when that happens, you know that summer is near, or in other words, you know that the season is changing. That's a good way to say it. You know that it's changing from one season to another. Okay? I want to hone in on the word know here for a moment before we move on and say this. Jesus is going to use the word know 7 times throughout these 7 parables or 6 parables. He's going to use the word 7 times. And the majority of the times that he uses the word know, he's going to say it to say that you are expected to know and that you should know and that you do know. There is an exception, and we're going to look at it in a moment, where he says, no one knows. No one knows the day or the hour. But what he's getting at here is he's using the word know in a positive sense. You do know. So when you see a fig tree giving off leaves, tender shoots, you know that summer is near positively. You can know, you do know, over and over again, you always know, because you're watching the signs of the season changing. Verse 33, so also. Guys, if grammar means anything and Jesus is remotely intelligent, by saying, which by the way, he's the most intelligent, when he's saying so also, what he's doing is drawing a parallel analogy between the fig tree and what he's about to say, okay? So it's the same thing. So in other words, it's right that you know that summer is near when the fig tree is doing its thing. The next thing we see is this. When you, so also, when, remember their question, when will these things be? All these things, and what will be the signs? So also, when you see all these things, when you see all these things, what are these things? It's the invasion of Jerusalem, the siege of Jerusalem, the desolation of the house that follows on the heels of what? The birth pains, verses 4 through 8, the social pressures, verses 9 through 14, which then sets in motion this catalytic event in verse 15, which is the abomination of desolation, which is the desolation of the house, which is what this whole conversation is revolving around from verse 38 and 39 of chapter 23. When you see all these things, what all, meaning not in isolation. It's not as though you can say, oh, there's a war, maybe it's the end. Oh, there's a famine, maybe it's the end. Oh, there's false prophets. Maybe it's the end. Maybe it's a sign. Jesus goes, no. Not in isolation. When you see all these things, you know. You know that what? He is near. So look at the grammar. When you see a fig tree putting off tender leaves, you know that summer is near, a season. But when you see all these things, you will know that he, a person, is near. His coming is near. He's directly answering their question, guys, from verse 3. That's very important. Why? Because they asked an intelligent question and he gave them an intelligent answer. It's coherent. It's understandable. It's not nebulous. It's not confusing. It's not mysterious. These things will happen. When you see these things, you can know that he is near, comma, at the very gates. Now bear in mind, Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives looking at the very gate, the eastern gate that Jesus will march through in his triumphal return. And he says, you know that he is near. He is at the very gates. Meaning this, once you see the abomination of desolation set up, guys, prepare for Jesus to walk through the eastern gate and to assume his rightful place on the throne of David, to set in motion the restoration of all things. He is near. This is important. Look at verse 34. Truly, I say to you, this generation, again, if grammar means anything, what is this? This is the generation that sees these things. When you see all these, the emphasis is not on you, meaning it's not on Peter and James and John. It's on seeing these things. The emphasis is these things. In other words, if you don't see these things, it's not you. It's not your generation. And the grammar of this, the structure of it is this generation, which is the generation that sees all these things, will not pass away until all these things take place. Guys, highlight, if you're a highlighter or a circler in your Bible, highlight all these things in verse 34 and connect it to verse 33. So also when you see all these things, when you see all these things. Again, what things? The birth pains, the social pressures, the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, which culminates in the second coming. That generation that sees and observes those signs will not pass away until all these things take place. Which means this: if you're alive in the generation that sees the abomination of desolation, you are the generation that will see the full package of Matthew 24 unfold. Jesus returning to Jerusalem and gathering the saints from the four corners of the earth. If you see the beginning, you'll see the end. Now, you may be witnessing it from here or from the balcony of heaven, depending on whether you survive. But the point is, in the time frame of a lifetime of a person, it's going to be very compressed. So if you see these things, it's only 42 months. It's not a long time. It's 3.5 years, 1,260 days. In many ways, you can do a stopwatch at that point. When the abomination goes down, and we're going to look at this tomorrow, you can actually know the days generally of the inauguration of his millennial reign when he assumes the throne in Jerusalem from the time that the abomination of desolation is set up. And we can also know the number of days from the time that the temple is rebuilt and the sacrifices begin to the time when they're cut off and they end. This is what we're going to look at tomorrow. And this is why Jesus doesn't go into a whole lot of detail in Matthew 24, because he goes, guys, all the detail's been given. You just haven't studied it. It's all there, though, in the book of Daniel. If you want to study it, let the reader understand. Go read Daniel, which is why tomorrow we're going to jump into Daniel. Verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. In other words, it's more likely for the sun and the moon and the stars and the planet to cave in on itself and to just evaporate and disappear than it is for Matthew 24 to not be fulfilled exactly as he said. That's just staggering and profound. So far, the first message is this: the battle for discernment. This is the battleground. Be discerning, guys. Watch the signs the way that a farmer would watch the fig tree and know that the season is changing. It's an early summer this year, a late summer. Watch the fig tree and you'll know. Now, people get, kind of goofy with the fig tree thing. They say, oh, the fig tree is this, or maybe the fig tree is the state of Israel, maybe this, maybe that. The point is not to interpret what the fig tree is. The point is to interpret the message of what this lesson is. What's the lesson of the fig tree? Now, yes, of course, the state of Israel is for sure a preliminary sign because the Jewish people had to come back into the land. But he's not saying that if you see the state of Israel rebirth, you're going to see the second coming. That's not what he's saying. That was 1948. That was 70 years ago. Now, we don't know how long. In 1967, they took the old city. Now the Jewish people are in possession and control over the old city of Jerusalem. That's pretty significant. I think that's probably constitutes a branch being tender and shooting forth and putting forth new leaves. I think so for sure. But the point is this: until you see the abomination of desolation, you're still in maybe mode. This is why it's so important to understand the Jerusalem-centric events and the Middle East-centric events, particularly the ones that are described in Daniel 11, which we're going to look at tomorrow, those events give you, I mean, incredible detail that eliminate any confusion as to what's going to lead up to the abomination of desolation, which is going to be very important. We just have to read it. So the first implication, the first battleground is just the battle for discernment. Meaning, don't be ignorant. Don't be blind. If the season's changing and you're not aware of it, that's on you. That's not on the Lord. And let's talk about this for a moment. Let's pause here and talk about this issue at the end of the age in preparation. When people will often say this is one of the most number one rebuttals I've heard over the years to people wanting to, in a way, discourage or get themselves off the hook of, or discourage other people from studying this issue at the end of the age. This is probably the number one thing I've heard. People say this: look, we just want to love God and love Jesus, and we want to share his love with other people. That's enough. We don't need to do all this end time kooky stuff. You know, why get bogged down in all that? Let's focus on what matters most, which is Jesus, loving God, loving Jesus, and sharing his love with other people. I want to say something that's going to sound very controversial first, and you're going to go, wait, hold on, but bear with me and let me explain it after I say it. And it's this: loving God is not enough. It's not enough in seasons of historic prophetic transition. It's not enough to just love God. There's heavy consequences if all you do is love God. Here's what I mean by that. Loving God biblically looks like obeying his commands. And so if there's commands associated with the generation of the Lord's return, and you may possibly be living in it, and you are resisting obedience to simple commands, to non-kooky things, very level-headed, down-to-earth, humble, normal, balanced, not crazy, not weird, not loopy. If you're disregarding those simple commands, you're not actually loving God. You're loving a God that's formed in your own image. And you're actually rejecting the God of the Bible, who commands that we respond in certain ways in moments of historic transition like this. Let me give you an example. Imagine living in the days of Noah and someone going, Noah, look, bro, water's going to come from the sky and God's going to drown everyone. Come on, man. Look, I've been around since the beginning of this whole thing, just like you have. I love God. This whole thing is crazy, though, that God would just destroy everyone and kill everyone. I'm not with you on this, man. You need to tone it down, and you need to, what are you building a boat, man? Dial it down. Let's just love God. Let's keep it normal. Okay. Here's the thing. If that was your perspective in the days of Noah, to just love God and to not listen to Noah, you would die with mud in your lungs and you would drown to death, you and your family, whether you love God or not. And I'm not saying that maybe that guy doesn't have a degree of affection and sincere love for God. That may be the case. But the reality is, if that sincere love for God doesn't transition into mature love for God that obeys him in all things, in seasons of transition, the cost for not being wholehearted in our devotion to the Lord is actually very costly. You could skip ahead to the Exodus. Say, Moses, look, man, I love God, but I don't want to wipe blood of an animal on my doorposts. Like, really? God's going to come kill my kid because I didn't put blood on my door? Like, it's kind of out there, bro. I'm just going to love God. Look, we're aware of this whole story. We've been around this whole thing from the beginning. I love him. I want to obey him, but I'm not going to do the blood on the door thing. If you don't obey the explicit commands that are specific to that generation, this is important, there are consequences. Now we could skip ahead. Isaiah's generation, Jeremiah's generation, same thing. Look, Jeremiah, look, I just want to love God. We love God. We're experiencing revival. Josiah is leading this awakening across the land. This is amazing. And you're telling us that God's going to give us over to our enemies. Jeremiah, what is wrong with you, man? No, I'm not going to receive your message. We love our nation. We love our people. We love our God. We love his book. We love him. And Jeremiah's going, okay, that's fine. That may be true, but what God is asking of you right now is actually to submit to the chastening the chastening rod of Babylon, to submit to this process of deportation. Don't fight it. Go with it. You have to submit to it and accept it. And they go, Jeremiah, no. Now, the thing is, if you resisted, Jeremiah, one of the most controversial parts of Jeremiah's message, which was so costly, is that Jeremiah said, look, you guys, if you don't submit to this thing, you're going to die with blades. Meaning the Babylonians are going to lead the invasion. They're not going to deport you to where you can live and eventually return back after the chastisement is over. You're going to die in the military incursion. So if you want to survive, submit to the word of the Lord. If you don't, you're going to die. Skip ahead to John the Baptist. You know, John the Baptist is speaking to tens of thousands of people coming out to see him in the wilderness. They're going, John, you know, what do we do? What's going on? And John says, well, my cousin, he's the Messiah. You go, John, come on. Your cousin, like the whole Nazareth? Really? He's the Messiah. I'm just going to love God and let this whole thing sort itself out. You know, God's sovereign. He's on the throne. All I can do is love God and worry about my family and my life and da-da-da-da-da. So, you know, whatever. Jesus comes on the scene. People go, that's that guy from Nazareth claiming to be I am. What? I don't know about all this. This is getting kind of weird, but I know I love God. Here's the thing, guys. If you didn't obey John the Baptist's message and you didn't heed Jesus's message, in the words of Jesus in Luke 19, because you did not recognize your time of your visitation, destruction is going to come upon you. There's consequences for it. You know, look at the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Revelation. Jesus is giving these messages to John to give to these 7 churches in Asia Minor at the time to say, look, yeah, you guys love God, but you need a prophetic understanding of the generation, the moment that you're living in, so that you can respond to the specific thing that's happening. Take Ephesians, the community in Ephesus. They had the letter that Paul wrote to them, the letter to the Ephesians, right? But the Lord still saw it necessary to come and speak to them prophetically, specifically about what they were going through as a community so that they could respond specifically. Now, the Bible is enough. The Bible's true all the time. But the thing is, guys, you can misappropriate and misapply Bible passages at the wrong time in human history and mislead people. And a huge part of this is knowing the day and the hour. Which, let's pick up there in verse 36. This is the next battleground. But he just said, you know that summer is near, so also you can know, you should know, you must know, and you see all these things that he's near. But here's the problem, okay? Again, if grammar means anything, the word but, or however, means now there's an added layer of complexity to it. You can know, you should know, you're expected to know, and it's possible to know. But concerning that day and hour of the day that he comes through the gates, okay? Because remember, the day and the hour here is not just the generic day and hour of his coming. The day and the hour is the day that he comes through the city gates of Jerusalem. Okay, why do we know that? Because he just said, verse 33, so also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the gates. That day, no one knows. So before we go on, let's just say this. We know for sure that he just commanded us to know the season. But now he's saying you can't know the day or the hour, which means at the tail end of the tribulation and the tail end of the second coming drama of Jesus actually returning, there's going to be some confusion over what day it's actually going to happen. And there's mysterious gaps of time in the framework prophetically in Daniel and Revelation and other passages that describe some bizarre things happening in the Arabian desert, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Assyria, around the Middle East. Some things are happening on the road from Basra to Jerusalem. There's a bizarre scenario taking place in the wilderness that's going to throw some confusion in. And add on top of that, there's going to be no sun, no moon, no stars, no light. So you're not actually going to even know what day it is anyway. And according to Isaiah chapter 24, the earth is going to be knocked off its axis because it's going to be so pummeled by the judgment events, that time itself is going to get lost. So part of not knowing the day or the hour is the fact that, one, there's mystery associated with the final days right before he enters the city gates of Jerusalem. The second thing is you're not actually going to know what day it is anyway, because all the clocks are going to get screwed up. The sky's going to go dark. Everything's going to be confusing, and you're going to be on edge going, what is happening? He goes on to say this: no one knows the day or the hour of him entering Jerusalem, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Okay, now most people just read that and use that as a cherry-picking proof text. Go, see, no one knows the day that Jesus doesn't even know. If Jesus doesn't know, surely we can't know. Now, guys, if Jesus says a statement that he doesn't know something that his Father knows, when he's also going to say a couple hours later, me and my Father are one, don't you think that maybe there's probably more going on here than him just pulling the ignorance card and saying, I don't know, I just work here, man? Do you really think it's legitimate to make the assertion that there's things that Jesus doesn't know that his Father knows, that he says in other passages he's one with the Father? Yeah, but Dalton, he was fully human, and Philippians 2, he laid down his right to certain things and subjected himself to the common human experience like us. He became one of us. He was the great mystery of godliness, that God was manifested in the flesh. Isn't it because of the mystery of the incarnation that he didn't know things? Yes, but guys, let's bear in mind, Jesus just gave us a very clear Bible study, basically saying, I'm aware of what's going to precede my return, guys. I'm not ignorant of, I just told you everything's going to happen leading up to it. What he's emphasizing here by saying, but no one knows, because think about it. He's a genius orator. He just said you can know, just like the fig tree season, you can know when he's going to be near. You're going to know when he's near. In fact, you're supposed to know when he's near. But no one knows the day or the hour. What he's doing here is he's encouraging diligence on our part to pay attention, not discouraging taking it seriously. Can you feel the difference? Most people use this passage to say, hey, he said no one knows, so therefore, guys, leave it alone. You can't know. He's not saying you don't know to encourage ignorance. He's saying you don't know to caution us and to warn us to watch and to pay attention. This becomes clearer as we go through this. Look at verse 37. For as it was in the days of Noah. So he's now doing another parable. It's just like the fig tree is this lesson. Discern the times and the seasons. Here's the next battleground. As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. So there's your parable. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. Verse 39, this is important. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man. This is very important. When you read the testimony from Genesis 6 through to the flood, Genesis 6, the Lord comes to Noah. Noah finds grace in the Lord's eyes. The Lord separates him, calls him apart, sets him apart, and says, Noah, in 120 years, I'm going to flood the earth. Prepare the earth. Proclaim righteousness. Hebrews and Peter tell us that he did that. Hebrews 11 and 2 Peter tell us that he preached righteousness and prepared the earth for the judgment to come. So why were people eating and drinking and giving in marriage until the day, and it says that they did not know. They did not know until the day, they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. So what he's doing is he's making a parallel between, you don't know the day or the hour, just as it was in the days of Noah. People didn't know the day or the hour. But who did know the day and the hour? Noah. Noah knew the day and the hour. He knew it 120 years out, then he knew it 7 days out, and then he knew the day of. Noah, get in the ark. The point is this: there is going to be a battle at the end of the age for prophetic proclamation to prepare people to get on the ark. There's going to be information. In fact, Amos tells us this: God does nothing without revealing it to his friends, the prophets. Nothing. In fact, throughout redemptive history, is there one example where God did something without preparing people through the prophets? Tell me, Exodus? Did he do the Exodus without telling people? No. Did he do the flood without telling people? No. Did he do Babylonian invasion without telling people? No. Did he do Assyrian invasion without telling people? No. Did he send the Messiah without telling people? No. Did he do the 70 AD judgment of Jerusalem and diaspora exile from Jerusalem? Did he do that without preparing people, giving them ample time and information to prepare to respond? No. God is so kind. He prepares people for these things, and he's preparing us now. But he's making a correlation in between verse 36 and verse 39. You don't know the day or the hour. As in the days of Noah, there was many who didn't know, but Noah knew, which means this. There's going to be a need for prophetic messengers who can prepare people, who can warn people, who can let people know what's coming. And so that people can follow in the calm, steady, adrenaline-less leadership of faithful shepherds who are obeying Jesus in the simple commands and bringing people into the straight and narrow path of preparing for the eschaton and walking towards that day with confidence, without fear, without anxiety. Look at this in verse 39. They were unaware until the day the flood came and took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Verse 40. Then, meaning when they're swept away, then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Guys, taken, there's been some funny books written about this, about how taken, you're out in the field and all of a sudden you look over and your friend's, pants are on the ground, your friend's gone. You go, oh my gosh, what happened? My friend was taken. Look, the taken here is connected grammatically to being taken away in the flood of judgment. Just like the days of Noah. If you're taken away, you're being swept away by the flood of the eschatological storm. You're not being taken away in a secret rapture to go sit up in heaven, eat popcorn, and watch the earth get pummeled by the tribulation events without any witness at all on the earth. That's not what's taking place in this passage. Taken away is a negative thing, not a positive thing. If you're in the field and one is taken away, you were swept away in the flood of the eschatological storm. It's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. Therefore, stay awake. There's your warning. Stay awake. So the second parable, which we just ended, the second parable is the battle, I believe, the battle for messengers and for faithful prophetic leadership. Because the main point of this thing is not knowing and knowing. And then the consequence of not knowing and knowing. The consequence of not knowing in this parable, the consequence is being swept away in a flood. That's the consequence. Meaning this, in Noah's day, the people who did not know were swept away. They were living life, eating, drinking, giving in marriage. Nothing wrong with eating, nothing wrong with drinking, nothing wrong with getting married. But if a week out from the flood, Noah's saying, hey guys, you got 7 days, you're still eating, drinking, giving in marriage. The issue is not lack of information. It's the issue of lack of responsiveness from the people who had ample information. So what we're looking at here with this issue of the end of the ages, as we've seen so far from Matthew 24, it's not as though Jesus is saying, hey guys, look, don't ask me that question in verse 3. You can't know, don't bother with it. I don't even know. No, he gives information and then says this, when you see these things, you'll know that he's near. And then he goes, but you don't know. Just like Noah's generation didn't know. And when Noah's generation didn't know, the consequence for not knowing and not preparing and responding was you were swept away in a flood. The same thing will happen in the generation of the Lord's return. People will be warned, but they won't respond. And I'm not just talking about people who've never heard the gospel before, unbelievers. I'm talking about people in the body of Christ are going to be swept away because they were not prepared for it. You say, well, Dalton, it says that, we're not destined for the wrath of God. The wrath of God's not going to fall. Guys, yeah, of course. If you're a believer, if you're bought with blood, if you're born of the Spirit, if you're adopted into the family and you're a part of the covenant family, the flood of judgment, I'm not talking about this in a sense of you didn't study the book of Revelation, therefore when it happens, you're going to go to hell forever. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is if you're unaware and ignorant when these events go down, you're going to be disillusioned, you're going to be offended, you're going to be confused, and then you're going to be of no good to the people around you who you are actually called to prepare and to walk through this storm with a calm and steady hand. And the whole Corona thing is a great example here in a very, 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 very small form. If you're calm in these days, people are going to flock to you. If you're fearful and full of anxiety, you're looking for people who are calm so that you can flock to them. Because if you have peace and stability in these times and you have clarity and you understand what God is saying, what he's doing, what he's like, what he's asking of us, that's gold. That's absolutely gold. And Noah had a steady hand in these days. He wasn't shaking in fear and ignorance. He knew. He was preparing people for it. And we need to be preparing each other for it as well and leading people calmly when these days begin to happen. Before the flood comes, we need to be like Noah. So parable number 1 is a battle for discernment. We need to discern and watch the signs of the season turning. Parable number 2, there's a battle for prophetic leadership. There's a battle for shepherding. There's a battle there to know how to trumpet the message and then what to do with your hands in the meantime. Noah built a boat. What do we do? How would the Lord have us respond? How would the Lord give of ourselves in the days ahead? Let's move on to the third one. Verse 42, the third parable picks up. Therefore, in other words, in light of that, in light of the fact of the consequences for not knowing when the flood was going to come, in light of that, stay awake. Stay awake. So this is going to be a battle for staying awake, a battle for alertness, for being alert, for being sharp, for being awake. The battle to not be sleepy, the battle to not be slumbering. Therefore, stay awake, because you do not know on what day your Lord is coming to the gates of Jerusalem. You don't know. So stay awake. The grammar in this one is incredibly important. Stay awake because you do not know. Okay, so that's our third mention of no, or third or fourth of the word know. Okay, you don't know. That's the word. No, you don't know. But, verse 43, but, however, in contrast to not knowing, know this. Know, you don't know this, but you do know this. Okay, know this, that if, hypothetically, if the master of the house had known in what part of the night, generally, what part of the night, not necessarily what hour, but if you knew what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not have let his house be broken into. Okay, look at the grammar. Stay awake because you don't know. But if you knew, you'd stay awake. Did you catch it? Stay awake because you don't know. But know this. If you had known, you would stay awake. The issue is not necessarily knowing, okay, it's going to be Tuesday at 9:35 a.m. that Jesus is going to walk through the city gates of Jerusalem. We don't care about that. I mean, we're going to care on those final days, but right now, guys, I don't care at all what day and what hour it's going to happen. What I want to know is the season. Am I living in the generation? That's a huge difference. Day and hour is not really important when you're living potentially at the beginning of it and you're wrestling with the question of, are we living at the beginning of these unfolding events or are we not? And should we know? Can we know? How do we know? It's like this. This is the analogy. If you knew what part of the hour that the thief was going to come, you'd stay awake. Meaning this, if you go to the grocery store near your house and you hear a couple of guys outside saying, hey, there's this house, and that you hear your address, and they say at this time, like, hey, sometime after midnight, let's do it after midnight. Let's break in and steal everything in their house. Now, if you walk by and you heard that, you go, that's my address. And you go, okay, you wouldn't go home and say, well, I guess I'll go to bed now, right? You'd stay awake, even though you don't know. Is it 1 o'clock? Is it 3 o'clock? I don't know what hour, but I know what part of the night. It's going to be the night. And it's going to be generally what part of the night it's going to come. I'm going to stay awake. So the point is this, the biblical command is stay awake. Okay. The present reality is you don't know. Okay. So then he gives you the basis for staying awake, or the way that you can stay awake is by knowing the part of the night. So again, even though he's saying you don't know, he's not using it to encourage ignorance. He's using it to discourage ignorance. He's using it to encourage us to pay attention to the hour. Because if you pay attention to the hour, you will stay awake. Therefore, you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. So be ready. The expectation, there's going to be confusion. The expectations are going to be all over the place in those days. So you need to pay attention. Be ready, prepared. That's encouraging preparedness, not discouraging preparedness, guys. Moving on to the next one. Verse 45. Let's check our time. Okay, we got to wrap this up here soon. Who then is the faithful and the wise servant, whom his master has set over his household, to give them food at the proper time, or in due season? Blessed is that master, blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. There's a lot in that one, but for sake of time, we're going to define it and just highlight a couple points and move on to the next ones and wrap this up for time's sake. This battle, I believe, is the battle for faithful leadership in the household of God. Okay, it's the household. Look at the term, set over his house. So we have a master and a household. You know, Peter said what? The household of God. Judgment begins in the household of God. So the household of God is the body of Christ. This is leadership within the body. So in a way, you could say the parable about Noah was about the battle for leadership among the nations, not necessarily in the house. It's preparing people who are unaware. Well, what's happening here is it's leadership in the house of the master in his house. Now, the charge given is feed the people in the household food at due season, in due season, or at the right time. Feed them the right diet at the right time. Meaning, you know, that doesn't make sense to us because we're like, food in due season. What does that mean? Meaning you don't take a kind of food, because back then agriculturally you'd take food and you'd have to wait for it to be edible because of seasons. You'd put it in things, you'd wait for things. You know, different Middle Eastern food, some of you can pull off and just eat it. Some of it you can't. Some of it you're gonna have to wait for seasonal things to happen. You're gonna have to wait for the fruit. You're gonna have to wait for the meat. You're gonna have to wait for things to be edible. He goes, feed them the food at the right time. That's what I'm asking you to do. Like, okay, the figs aren't ready to eat yet, guys. You pull them off the tree too soon. Don't feed it to the household yet if it's not ready, okay? And also, don't feed them food that's rotting. Like, that's the wrong season to be eating this. How many of you pulled a fruit off of a tree at the wrong season? You ate the fruit and you went, ooh, that's bitter. That doesn't taste good. Why? Because you're eating the food at the wrong season. And Jesus is saying this, what's going to define faithful leadership in the generation of the Lord's return is feeding people food that's appropriate for the season of history that you're living in. And I want to say this humbly and gently, but I also want to say this clearly and with a degree of force with this. I believe that many leaders, shepherds, preachers, teachers, authors in the body of Christ today in the Western world are feeding people food that's not appropriate for the hour of history that we're living in. It might be good a month ago. It might have been good. It might be good in 3 months in a food analogy, but it's not good for right now. We need to be preparing people with food in due season, preparing people with the right spiritual diet for the days and the pressures ahead. And if you don't feed people in due season, because you say my master is delayed, which is a scoffing, mocking spirit that's saying this, while he's gone, we can do whatever we want because we're not accountable. It's scoffing. Look, they always said he's going to come and he's not coming back. Every time they say the master is going to come, He's not here. He's gone. So it's up to us now. The master's away. He entrusted it to us. And the Lord says this, that kind of leadership is abusive. And it's comparable to drunkenness. Look at, he beats the servants and eats and drinks with drunkards. It's abuse and drunkenness, this kind of leadership. The kind of leadership that the Lord is raising up in the days ahead to prepare the church, the body of Christ, the household of God, are leaders who are going to feed people food in due season, which means the events of Matthew 24 and 25 are events that is food in due season. That is food that the Lord wants us to be feeding the people. And this is part of the reason why we're doing this study during this fast, during this whole global phenomenon, crisis of this corona thing, is we're feeding and feasting on food that's appropriate for the hour of history that we're living in. Guys, the corona thing is a speed bump blip on the radar compared to what's coming for the Middle East and the nations. And right now, we're going to talk about this more tomorrow, but how many of you guys know that we're a minute away from a temple being rebuilt in Jerusalem? And if we're a minute, I mean, the Temple Institute already has the whole temple prepared to move on to the Temple Mount. It's ready. It could happen anytime. All you need is a couple geopolitical events to change the dynamic on the Temple Mount. And like that, overnight, the temple will be rebuilt. If we're on the verge of the temple being rebuilt, guys, you are living in the first generation in human history since the generation of the apostles that could say with absolute certainty that it's possible that Jesus could come back in your lifetime. Because the temple is being rebuilt. If it's being rebuilt, that means this, the temple could be desolated. Because that is the primary sign of the times. And here's the reality. If many people in our churches in the Western world don't know what the abomination of desolation is and have never studied the book of Daniel because we've never fed, as leaders, we've never fed the people that food, that's on us. Which is why there's a heavy consequence here. They're going to be cut into pieces, thrown with the hypocrites into the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. This isn't like, oh, hey guys, you're going to lose your reward. This is you're going to be thrown with the hypocrites. This is unfaithful leadership. Now, you asked Dalton, are you saying that people who don't teach on the end times are going to get thrown to hell forever? That's not what I'm saying. Okay, that could be misconstrued to imply that. But what I'm saying is this, is that leadership in the generation of the Lord's return, faithfulness is going to be measured by, in part, by how you prepared the people, by how you fed them. And if you refuse to feed them, the consequences on the spectrum are going to be pretty severe. Some pastors and leaders are just going to be caught off guard, and they're going to just fall into confusion with the rest of everybody. But there's going to be leaders who are actually going to be cut in half and thrown into hell forever because of their failure to lead, and their failure, not just failure to lead, but their resistance to the simple commands of God of how to prepare and respond and to serve the people. This parable tells us about Jesus' zeal for his people and for the household. 3 more parables. We're going to wrap this up very quickly. It pains me to not have more time to do this because we need more time. And we may do some bonus messages and throw them up here just for these other ones. But for now, let's just go through it real quick. Verse 25, chapter 25, verse 1, Jesus is going to talk about the kingdom of heaven with 10 virgins. Okay. This one's probably the one that we're all most familiar with. You know, you have a wedding, you have virgins, you have lamps, you have oil. And the mandate is this, go get oil before the night falls, because if you don't have oil when the dark night is upon you, you're not going to have oil to illuminate the path for you or the people around you when the dark night bears down upon us. So go get oil. Now, for time's sake, we can't get into all the glory of this. This is one of my favorite ones because it's, you know, there's some really beautiful, powerful stuff in here, but suffices to say this, is that the message, the battleground of this one, if the last one was the battleground for faithful leadership in the household of God, the next parable is the battle for personal intimacy with Jesus. Oil in your lamp, that you will be, as John the Baptist was, burning on the inside, shining on the outside. Your oil is your own relationship with Jesus that no one else can do for you. No one else can have a relationship with Jesus for you. Meaning, I can go buy oil, but you can't have my oil when the night comes. Now, I can forge a life in God, but when the days get heavy, you can't come and go to your pastor, your leader, the guy that you normally go to for spiritual advice and say, hey, man, can you give me some of your oil? The guys can say, you should have got oil before the dark night. Because here's the reality. Whatever you have before the tribulation begins is what you're going to take into the tribulation. Now, some people, there's going to be a massive harvest in the tribulation, and lots of people are going to encounter Jesus for the first time. But this is a message for people who are in the family of God now. What the message is this, guys, invest into oil now. Invest into it because you want to be burning and you want to be shining. And if you're not, again, there's going to be consequences for that because you're going to be unprepared and you're going to be knocked off. Your equilibrium is going to be lost because you're not going to know what he's doing. And a big part of this parable is that it wasn't just that they didn't have oil. It's that because they didn't have oil, they didn't know the way. And because of it, they were shut out from the wedding feast. So the wedding feast is heavy terminology in terms of the book of Isaiah, the book of Revelation. The wedding feast is a very significant event. And so what he's saying here is that if you don't have oil, there's going to be lots of people, and we're going to, Stephen and some others are going to talk about this once we get into some other sessions in the New Testament about the falling away, but there is coming a falling away, guys. It's wrong to assume that everyone who's going into the tribulation is going to come out of the tribulation proclaiming the name of Jesus. We know that many are going to betray one another. Many are going to fall away. Many are going to depart and leave and walk away from the faith altogether. In fact, a falling away is one of the signs of the times in 2 Thessalonians 2. The day of the Lord will not come until the man of sin is revealed and the great falling away happens. Get oil, because if you don't have oil, a falling away is ahead. You need oil. You need oil. Now, the last two parables, the one is the talents. I'm going to make this one very quickly by just saying this because it's very long. I'm going to hone in on one verse and then we'll skip to the next one. Look at verse 24. Read it on your own, but it's basically this. The master gives talents, okay? He's going to give money to different amounts of money to different people, and they're going to do different things with it. Someone's going to multiply it. Someone's going to hold on to his. Someone's going to bury it and do nothing with it. Different ones do different things, okay? And typically when this is preached, the preacher says, hey, therefore, you need to be wise with how you invest your time, your energy, your resources, because it's all about investment and stewardship. You need to steward. Look, I think that's great. I think stewardship is very important. I think that this parable could, help with that. If we're talking about stewardship, I can think of some other passages in the Bible that give a better window into stewardship, but nevertheless, look at verse 24. He who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you can have what is yours. But his master answered him and said, You wicked and slothful servant. Wicked and slothful. Okay, here's the deal. The issue in this parable is not about stewardship. It's about what you believe about God to be true. It's the battle for the true knowledge of God. Why? Because why did he not steward the talent right? Why did he steward it the way that he did? Because I was afraid of you, and I knew you, not I thought you, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed, which means an unjust man. And I was afraid of you. You're a fearful man. Hard, unjust, cruel. Let me bottom line this. If you go into the tribulation fundamentally believing that God is unjust and cruel and hard, you are going to make terrible decisions with how to steward everything about your life, even your own soul. Because you're not going to trust him, you're not going to love him, you're not going to be clear-eyed and clear-headed, and your heart is going to be completely full of turmoil inside because you are afraid of the one who loves you the most. You have hidden accusations in your heart towards the kindest, most just person in the universe, and you have accusations that he is an unjust taskmaster, that he's cruel, that he breaks rules, that he can't be trusted, and therefore if he can't be trusted, how are you going to worship someone and love someone and obey someone that you don't trust? This parable has way more to do about what you believe about God than it does how you steward the money or the resources or the time or the things that you possess. The stewardship is downstream, and it will always be downstream. You know this to be true, right? When you believe in the generosity of God, you are generous. It's 2 Corinthians 3, right? We're transformed into what we are beholding. If you behold God to be a hard, unjust man, you will be a hard and unjust man. Or you'll be a hard man and trying to be a just man in protest of the unjust God. That is terrifying. So I want to exhort you in this during this fast. Guys, the subject of the end times is not about so that you can get your charts and graphs right. It's so that you can be awakened and quickened to pursue what matters most. And what matters most is your knowledge of God. What matters most is personal intimacy with him that is non-transferable, that you can't get from someone else. It's the battle for faithful leadership, the battle for discernment. Guys, these are heavy things, and these are all heart issues. What you believe about God is the most important thing about you. And that will inform how you navigate in the days ahead when the tribulation begins to barrel forward. The last one, Joel's going to touch on this. Nikolai, Zechariah, we're gonna be looking at some passages that are going to help hone in on this passage. But I want to end with this. Verse 31, the final parable, which again, I don't believe it's actually a parable. I believe he's wrapping up the message by giving the capstone. This is his conclusion. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him. Now remember, verse 3, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? And then he says in verse 29 through 31, he'll be coming after the tribulation, after the abomination, after the birth pains. Then he will come in the clouds. Verse 31, when the Son of Man comes. Okay, so I just told you the signs of the times, guys. That's what Jesus is saying. I just told you, my disciples, the signs of the times. Now, let me tell you something else. When the Son of Man comes, we're not talking signs anymore. We're talking about the reality of the thing. When he comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. See what I mean? This isn't a parable now. We're back to prophecy. He will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right, the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, and you guys know the story, the right is going to be sheep, the left is going to be goats, okay? The one is going to enter into paradise. Why? Because they took care of who? Those who were naked, who were in prison, who had no food, who had no water. Okay? He said, you came and you did it to me. And they go, you weren't, it wasn't you, Lord. And the Lord goes, it was as if you did it to me because you did it for the least of my brethren. And on the other side, he says, because you did not do it for me. They go, when were you in prison? When were you hungry? When were you thirsty? We didn't do that to you. That's an unjust accusation. We didn't do that to you. Then he said, no, but you did it to the least of my brethren. Guys, when Jesus says the least of my brethren, what he's talking about, who is Jesus's brethren? Who's Jesus's brethren? His brethren, that's the same terminology that the Apostle Paul uses in Romans 9, 10, and 11, where he talks about the nation of Israel being his kinsmen, his brethren, according to the flesh. Now, some people have said, well, yeah, but in Mark, Jesus says that we are his brothers and sisters, meaning the disciples, the believers are the least of. So this passage should actually be talking about how people treat Christians during that time. Okay, to a degree, yes, but the context of this, which is very important, we're going to look at in subsequent sessions, Jesus is not making this text up, talking about sitting on a throne in Jerusalem, judging nations, separating nations. He's quoting Joel chapter 3. And in Joel chapter 3, you can go read it later, he's judging the nations for how they shed the blood of the Jewish people as they divided the land of Israel and set in motion the time of Jacob's trouble. The book of Joel climaxes with a prophecy about how Jesus will roar from Zion and establish his throne and judge the nations on behalf of the Jewish people, which means this: the final battle will be the battle for Jerusalem, the battle for the land of Israel, the battle over the Jewish people. And Jesus is saying this is a heart issue, not a political issue. Because in these days, Jewish people are going to be in prisons. Jewish people are going to be naked. Jewish people are going to be without food. Jewish people are going to be without water. And it will be very costly for you, as it was costly for the church in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. It will be costly for the church at the end to stand with the Jewish people when they go through this fire. You go, well, that seems outlandish that this could be the Jewish people. Guys, why? He just said in Matthew 24, verses 15 through 21, that the beginning of the greatest trouble in human history is set in motion by a military event in Jerusalem that sets in motion the expulsion of a considerable and substantial part of the population of Judea, which means we have Jews in flight, Jews without food, Jews without water, Jews likely going into prison camps. Which means this: the judgment of the nations at the end of the age is going to hang on this question of how did you treat Jesus's brethren in the midst of their greatest hour of suffering. That will determine the eternal fate of individuals, kings, nations, and governments. Look, this thing is very heavy. It ends with, he will answer to them, verse 45. Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. Guys, we're talking eternity here. We're talking lake of fire. In fact, in one of the passages before this, he talks about how the eternal fire, verse 41, was prepared for the devil and his angels. He's saying, I'm going to send people to the eternal fire that was appointed for the evil one. They're going to go there with him. This is not about you participating in the local soup kitchen in your neighborhood to take care of the generic poor. Again, if you're looking for verses that talk about encouraging people to care for the poor, guys, there's a lot of verses that talk about that. I can give you verses that are more useful for that. Jesus is not hanging the threat, the warning of eternal judgment on how you cared for the poor. He's hanging it on the issue of the Jewish people. You go, wait a minute, Jesus is going to send people to hell forever based on how they treat Jews? Come on, man. Are you serious, Dalton? Is that intellectually valid in any way to say that Jesus will send people to hell on the basis of how they treat Jews? I mean, look, I'm not an anti-Semite, man, but that's going a little bit too far here to say that he's going to put that much stock in how people treat Jews and Israel as a nation in those days. How? And I believe the answer would be this, and I'll answer it by closing with this. In the 1930s and 40s, imagine living next to a Jewish community in Poland or Germany. Imagine being part of a Christian community. And imagine watching the roundup of your Jewish neighbors. And then imagining your pastor, your priest, your local spiritual leader saying, hey guys, don't rock the boat. Keep quiet, because you could lose your life for this. Now, in the Holocaust, you had three groups of people. You had people who were participating in it zealously, participating in the annihilation of the Jewish people. They were supporting it. They loved the idea of it. Then you had people who were against it, and they were not going to participate in it. They lost their lives for it. These are heroes, righteous among the nations, that said no. There were not many, but they said no. Then you had another group of people we could call it the mushy middle crowd, who is in the middle, and they said, look, well, we don't want to throw all in and like help execute the Jews, but we also don't want to stand up for what's right. And so we're just going to stand in the middle, and we're going to be quiet, just hope. We're just going to sing our worship songs louder while the cattle cars full of Jews pass by. We're going to hope that this thing goes past. Tell me, when you stand before God and you say, well, Jesus, I loved you, do you think Jesus during that time, how do you think Jesus is going to respond to the European church that stood idle or complicit or participated in it? Now, here's the thing. Some people, you're going to get rewarded if you stand with the Jews, okay? Because you're not just standing with the Jewish people, you're standing with the reality of covenant and affirming Jesus's identity and destiny as the son of David who will rule on the throne of David. This is not an issue of political affirmation of the state of Israel. Look, I love the state of Israel, but that's not what this is about. This is about the nation, the people of Israel who are going to be undergoing this scourge. And Jesus is saying, when the abomination of desolation is set up, global church, pay attention. It's your finest hour. You need to throw yourself into the fray and to stand shoulder to shoulder with the sons and daughters of Jacob as they go through this time. If you do, I'll reward you. If you throw in with the nations who are trying to annihilate them, I'll cut you in half. If you're indifferent and you stand in cowardice in the middle, I don't know. We'll work that out on that day. But what do you want to be? Do you want to be counted with the evil? Do you want to be counted with the righteous? Or do you want to be counted with the cowards in the middle who stood and not knowing which decision to make? Which, interestingly, that's how the book of Joel climaxes. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, in the valley of Jehoshaphat, in front of the Temple Mount, in front of the Mount of Olives, in the valley of decision, trying to decide which side they're going to pick. Jesus says this, in the generation of the Lord's return, don't be in the valley of decision. Stand with Jesus's commands and fight these battles in your heart, these battlegrounds now before these days begin. So with that, we have now wrapped up Matthew 24 and 25. And in our next session, we're going to jump into the book of Daniel to explore some of the passages that Jesus was referring to in Matthew 24 and 25. Bless you, and Maranatha.